Welcome to the Foster in Palo Alto, California. We are a unique museum dedicated to sharing the watercolor journeys of artist explorer Tony Foster. We hope to inspire reflection, discussion, and education about art, wilderness, and the natural world. With this series of 4 videos, we invite you on a tour of the museum with the artist explorer himself. Please join Tony on the 3rd of the series, Sacred Places, Watercolor Diaries from the American Southwest.
This whole project started actually after I'd had an exhibition in Ketchum, Idaho, and the exhibition sold out. In fact, I think it sold out before it opened, so that was always a good sign for any artist. You love that. And so we went for a meal afterwards. So I had a bunch of friends and the gallery director and all sorts of people. We always have a celebratory meal. So people said, "What are you going to do next?" And I said, "Well, I was thinking of doing something about sacred places of the world." And everybody said, "Oh, that's an interesting idea." So I said, "Look, what I'm interested in is where people have designated certain natural phenomena as sacred. In other words, some fantastic rock that sticks up in a desert, or some ancient tree that people revere, or every community really has something where some extraordinary thing in the landscape which they think of as a place of reverence." Anyway, everybody thought, "Oh, that's a marvelous idea," and everybody got enthusiastic about it and said, "Oh yeah, we'll come, we'll help you sort it out." And so I went away feeling quite cheery. But when I got home, I suddenly thought, "Wait a minute, what am I talking about?" A lot of these places, certainly they're revered by all these different cultures, but it would mean I'd have to go, for instance, to Ayers Rock in Australia, which is covered in partying tourists, throwing beer cans down from the top, or having barbecues on the top, and that was sacred to the Aborigines, of course, but now it's become a tourist trap. I don't want to go there, because my stuff's all about quiet places, really. And I then thought, and I don't want to go to the tree that Buddha sat under, because that's visited by millions of Buddhists every year to revere this particular tree. So anyway, what am I thinking of? There's only me, for heaven's sake, and I can't go all around the world doing these places. It cost me an absolute fortune, and spend the rest of my life doing it and still not end up with a conclusion. So I thought, I'm approaching this from the wrong direction. So I thought, what I've got to do is I've got to find somewhere which has got a real mixture of faiths, who sort of lay claim to bits of it as being important to them, and also is possible for me to at least visit a few times to work there, and also has got an interesting and wild sort of landscape. And of course, my focus then came right down from the entire world to the Four Corners, because of course you have the Native American cultures, all the different tribes, and they all have places which are very special to them. You have the Mormons who came into the Southwest, and although they don't profess to have places that they revere, nonetheless there are places that are very important to them, natural places which are important in Mormon history. So we've got the Mormons, and then we've got the Catholics who came up with Cortez in the 16th century, and many of them stayed, and the Catholic faith took root therefore in the Southwest, and also of course you've got the New Age believers in the New Age. I don't know if we call it a faith or a philosophy or whatever we call it, but nonetheless there are fervent believers in the New Age culture, all of whom think of places like Sedona as being, almost the center of their universe. And so I thought that's really a rich thing to explore. And so that's how I started. And once I looked into it, I had a great deal of help. I have a friend who was the director of education at the Grand Canyon, and then became director of, the Geological Survey in New Mexico. And he is married to someone who was a cultural anthropologist for New Mexico. And so I went and stayed with them, and we spread the map out of the Four Corners, spread the map out on their dining room floor, and immediately started putting red spots on it. And they were saying, now if you go here, this is really important to the Navajo because of such and such a thing. And they not only pointed out all these places on the map that I ought to go and have a look at, but they also knew which side it looked the best from. They had such a wonderful memory of the geography of their area that they knew, for instance, that Cabezon Peak looked better from, I can't remember where it was, southwest than it was from the northeast. And so we had a wonderful weekend kind of going through the books and going through the diaries and going through all sorts of things and spotting places that I ought to at least make a start. And so with that as my starting point, I then went into the southwest, took my tent and my painting stuff and made a start. And of course, as I started doing it, then more ideas came forward. Lots of other people got involved and said, oh, have you thought of such and such a place? This is really important, and so on. What I wasn't trying to do was trying to ask people why they thought these places were sacred. Because it seems to me that particularly the Native Americans are not happy, or they can be a bit hostile if they think you're trying to prize secrets out of them about why they think a particular rock is sacred, or what makes them believe that, you know, this tree is more important than that tree, or whatever it is. And I wasn't trying to winkle secrets out of anybody. I just, if it was commonly agreed that somewhere was sacred, then that was good enough for me. I didn't have to know why. I just had to know that it was sacred to somebody, so some faith or some tribe or some belief system. And then my part in it was to go to that place and sit and work and quietly and just try and absorb what the place had to tell me and see if it became sacred to me, which many of these places in the end did. I could understand why people thought they were important and sacred. And so that was the basis of it. And I found that just by sitting quietly and working, most of the time, people who might have been hostile actually came up and saw what I was doing and started talking and actually opened up. And so it became quite a rich experience in the end. But at first, I was conscious that there was just me sitting there, you know, in the middle of in the middle of the Navajo lands or something, and hoping that nobody minded. And mostly they didn't. Mostly they would come up and go, "What are you doing?" And I'd say, "Oh, I'm just doing this painting, you know." And they say, "Why?" And I say, "Well, you know," and I'd explain, and they go, "Oh, okay." And then they would perhaps open up and talk about why they thought it was sacred. So that was the start of the thing, and we'll just walk around and talk a bit about some of the paintings. I don't think we'll talk about all of them, it'd be too tedious. But so we'll start with this, because when I first started the project, I wasn't at all sure that aesthetically I could make it work. I could see that philosophically there was a good idea there, but what I wasn't sure about was whether aesthetically there would be enough material there to actually make a series of paintings. And so I was driving around for quite a while. My dealer at that time, Jerry Peters in New Mexico, lent me an old truck, and I trundled around the Southwest quite a bit trying to pinpoint some of these places and think about how you could make a painting of them. And so everybody said, "Oh, you've got to go to Mesa Verde." So I went to Mesa Verde and I looked around and I thought, "Oh, it's blooming difficult to paint this. It's just the top of a mesa with a lot of trees on it, and the interesting bits were kind of tucked away in the caves underneath, all the archaeology, and I don't really paint archaeology, that's not my thing." And so I thought, I'm not sure how I'm going to do anything about this, and I was just driving out at dusk one day, utterly despondent, thinking, I don't think this is going to work at all, and I just happened to see shiprock sticking up in the middle of the desert, and I thought, wow, that's an extraordinary thing. I could see how that might make a painting. And so really, it was this little painting here that kind of anchored the idea that actually, if I were to explore and study the thing carefully enough, there was enough material here to make a show. And so I went back to Mesa Verde. I became actually artist in residence there, and they gave me a little hogan to live in, which was wonderful, this little half-buried octagonal stone building, which had all mod cons. It was absolutely wonderful. So it meant that I could live in there perfectly happily. I didn't have to live in my tent. And I did this painting then of shiprock in the desert. This is in the early morning with the light just opening up. And the marvelous thing is although a lot of these trees are burnt and so on, nonetheless you've got these fantastically sinuous shapes which draw your eye to the main point of the painting, which is shiprock. And then when I'd done that, I then sat in their museum and borrowed these pot shards from their from their reserve collection, and did a whole series of studies about, of course, really to point up the fact that although this is a natural landscape, nonetheless people have lived here for many hundreds or thousands of years, and so it didn't always belong to the national park. It used to belong to the Anasazi tribes that lived there, and so that's really how it started. And from there, then I just really went to the spots on my map and ticked them off one by one. So in this case, this was Canyon de Chelly, and I went on horseback into Canyon de Chelly with a Navajo called Terrell, and I think he was a bit of a joker because he gave me a horse. What was it called, the horse? Perky. It was called Perky, and it was damn perky because it had been a racehorse. It was a retired racehorse, this thing. And altogether, my little party, where I think there was 5 or 6 of us, who my friends had come with me, and Terrell was looking after us. Anyway, he gave me Perky, and I'm no horseman. I've been on horses a few times, but when I've had to get from one place to another, but generally I'm not a horseman. So old Perky would always have to be at the front, and she would nearly leave me behind as well. And in the end, I realized that if you took a stick and just tapped it on the front legs, it would stop a bit. But I was always having to hold Perky back like this. But anyway, we went around Canyon de Chelly. But funnily enough, I didn't really find anything to paint in Canyon de Chelly. But then I went around the rim and found, first of all, I found this with this wonderful little river running through here. There's a very sad story about Canyon de Chelly because the Navajo who lived there perfectly happily and grew fantastic peach trees. They were famous for their peach trees, and when they were kicked out of there by the U.S. Army and taken to what was it called, something de Rondo, where many of them perished because they just couldn't live there. And in the end, it was such a shameful episode in American history that the Congress allowed the Navajo to go back. But by that time, their water courses, their water wells had all been poisoned, their houses had all been burnt down, and all their trees had been chopped down, and in order to punish them for trying to stay there. And so, but they've re-established themselves very well. They've regrown their trees, and they live perfectly happily in Canyon de Chelly, and they're very, very protective of it. And so this is why we've got peach stones along here, just to remind people of that piece of American history, which is not one of your shining moments, I've got to say. And the other really important part of Canyon de Chelly is this fantastic rock here called Spider Rock. And the Navajo believe that Spider Woman lived on Spider Rock, and Spider Woman taught the Navajo to weave. And so this is very important to Navajo. And so I sat and did this painting here, and in order to refer to the whole weaving culture of the Navajo, I bought this little weaving here and put it in the painting as a note about the fact that this is all about weaving. And the very nicest thing that happened about that was that this weaver, whose name is Barbara Teller Orneas, who is the Navajo's finest weaver. And this is the most beautiful, unfortunately you can't feel it, but it feels like silk, but actually it's wool, but it's the most beautiful, beautiful piece of weaving. And she wove that in response to my painting. She loved the colors of my painting, and she loved how I'd done it. And so she wove this in response to it, which I took as a huge compliment to me, because of course, she was artist in residence at the Smithsonian, I think, and very, very famous weaver. And so I was deeply honored that she did that for me. So it worked out well. The only other little story that's attached to this really is that in my village in Tywardreath in Cornwall, we have a harvest festival every year when people bring in great big onions and marrows and all sorts of things they've grown, and fish and lobsters they've caught, and pies they've cooked and so on, and cakes, and they're all brought into the pub, and they're all auctioned off for huge sums of money for charity. And so when I was leaving, I said to Steve, the landlord, I said, I'm leaving for a couple of months, Steve. I've got to go and work in New Mexico and go and work in Arizona and New Mexico and so on. And he said, oh, Tony, you're going to miss the Harvest Festival. And I said, oh, I love that. And he said, well, we take telephone bids, you know. So I said, oh, yeah, right. Anyway, and so when I was working on this painting, I thought, I bet today is the Harvest Festival. And so I worked out the time, and I was rather at a low point here, and I couldn't get any signal. So I scrambled up stood on a pile of rocks, and managed to get a signal and phoned the pub. And Steve answered. He said, "New in, tired breath." And I said, "Hey, Steve, it's Tony here." "Tony, you all right, mate?" So I said, "Yeah, I'm fine." He said, "What do you want?" And I said, "Well, I've just phoned up to bid in the auction." And he went, "Bloody hell." He said, "Hey, shut up, everybody. It's Tony. He's phoning from Arizona." And so he said, I said, "What are you selling at the moment?" He said, "Oh, we're selling a bunch of marrows." So I said, "Oh, I don't want any marrows." He said, "Well, what do you want?" I said, "I want only have Julie's pies left." He said, "Hold on, I'll find any of Julie's pies left?" And they said, "Yeah, there's one left." "Well, put that up." "Well, we're in the middle of the marrows." "Never mind that. This is costing Tony a fortune. Start on the pies." So he said, "How much do you want to pay?" So I said, 12 quid. And he said, "You'll not get it for 12 quid. So I said, "Well, start at 12. So he went, 12 on the phone from Arizona, £12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26. On the phone from Arizona, £26 for the pie. Any advance? Gone." So I said, "You having a good time?" He said, "Everybody's having a good time except Anne." That's my wife. And I said, "Oh, really? What's up?" He said, "Well, I think you've just spent all her money." So I must admit, when I switched the phone off, I felt so homesick I could have wept. But anyway, it was a great. And of course, when I got home, everybody was going, "Fancy you phoning from Arizona getting that pie."
I think it was Bosque Redondo.
Sorry?
Was it Bosque Redondo?
It was Bosque Redondo. Thank you. Exactly that. That's right. The whole tribe were shipped or forced to march to Bosque Redondo and kept there for years. Many of them just died because it was impossible for them to live there. And eventually, as I say, Congress was so ashamed of themselves that they allowed them back, but not until everything had been destroyed. But anyway, they as I say, they're very protective of the place now, and not surprisingly. So this is Chaco Canyon. I didn't find that much in Chaco Canyon that I wanted to paint. Chaco Canyon, if you've never been there, is just the most extraordinary place. If you think that the Native Americans didn't actually have much architecture, you want to go to Chaco Canyon. These enormous buildings are being put up there, and nobody knows really who did it or what they did for water, because there's no water there. And yet they have these huge buildings, great storehouses, and a very, very complex architectural, just a very, very complex architecture, very complex planning, and all there. It is an astonishing place. But I don't want to paint buildings. That's not what I do. So in fact, the only thing I got from there were these two little paintings, I think. And this one was nearly a catastrophe because everything. I hiked all the way up here. You have to go up onto the rim and hike for about 3 hours to get to this little spot, because I'd spotted that you could make a little painting out of that. And I got there and then found I'd left my paint box behind, back in my tent. And so I had to hike all the way back down again, get my paint box, go back up again. And so that was nearly a catastrophe, which is why it says here, "Sort out this mess, idiot," was one of my notes, because I got so cross with myself for having messed it up. But anyhow, so that was Chaco Canyon. And this was done actually while I was at Mesa Verde. And this is a place called Sleeping Ute. So that's the Ute tribe. And from where I'm sitting, it doesn't look like a sleeping ute. It doesn't look like sleeping anything. It looks like just a very nice landscape. And so I did the painting here, and this is a hailstorm coming in, which finally hit me. So I just managed to get that done before I got drenched with a hailstorm. But I then went and found where Sleeping Ute looks like a sleeping ute. And so I did a drawing of what it looks like. And so you can see it's a Native American with his arms folded, and there are his feet there. And so it does look like a Native American lying down. And the Utes are famous for their horsemanship. which is why I got a fetish of a horse to put in that picture. And this, of course, is I think the only picture you'll ever find of mine so far which has got a bit of architecture in it. And so I sat, because I was artist in residence, they gave me a little bit of leeway about where I went. And so I went and sat in one of the old ruined buildings and did the view looking out. And there again, I did this little fetish because when I was leaving there, it seemed to me I saw a lynx. I thought I'd seen a lynx. And when I went back and talked to the rangers, they said, no lynx round here. Must have been a bobcat. But anyway, I'm pretty sure it seemed to be a lynx to me. It looked like a grey shade, and I thought perhaps it was the ghost of the people who used to live in these houses that I'd seen. Early on in the project, I went to live in a monastery, Christ in the Desert Monastery, and the monks there, it's a silent order, and so you stay in complete silence all day. And then after complete silence, after 7 o'clock, it becomes profound silence. But I found it quite chummy because I'm quite used to being in places and not seeing anybody at all and not speaking to anybody. So I'm used to that. There was no problem. But being able to sit and eat meals with other people, it was very nice, I thought, and quite friendly compared to how I often am on my own. And I enjoyed going to the services in the evening and listening to them chanting in plain song, Latin plain song. The only thing was, of course, there are all sorts of rituals attached to that, and you have to stand up at certain times and turn around at certain times and then kneel at certain times. And of course, I was like a kind of new boy at school. I was always standing up too late or turning around too late. But anyway, nobody seemed to mind, and I did enjoy listening to the singing. And all these 3 paintings were all done at Christ in the Desert Monastery. It's a Benedictine order. And if you look closely on this one, you'll see that this is the little monastery church here. And it's made out of the same rock as the surrounding rock, and so it's nearly invisible, but there it is, just there. And as I say, very seldom do I paint a building in my paintings, but there is one there. And if you look at the souvenirs here, or what are we calling them, souvenirs, all of them have got Christian symbolism. The shell, for example, is the symbol for a pilgrim. A white stone, the white rock is a symbol of purity. There's a little cross made out of a few twigs that I picked off a bush. There's a little Catholic medal, and then I've sort of made up, what do they call those things where they have, where you put a saint's teeth or bits of the true cross, and they have a wonderful...
Relics?
Sorry?
Is it a relic?
Reliquary. It's a reliquary. And so I was making up my own reliquaries. And the reliquary in here, the sacred thing in here, is simply the sand, really. In other words, the ground that we live on. And sealed up with gold seals to make it look a bit more like a reliquary. And then the same here, the same souvenirs here, except that we've got a rosary here made by I think that was made by some nuns who they have them for sale in the monastery. And the same symbols here, Christian symbols, and here again the same thing. But this was made by a monk. This was a rosary made by a monk. And this picture here, because of course you're not allowed to speak, you can't tell anybody where you're going. And so normally speaking, if I'm going off into the back country and I'm with people, I'll say, look, I'm going to climb up there, and I'm going to climb up there and look for a site. And if I'm not back by dark, start worrying. But you couldn't say that because you weren't allowed to speak to the monks. And so I would go off and explore, trying to look for painting sites. And in this case, I was trying to get to the top of this mesa. I thought that would be interesting to look from there to see what I could see. And I was climbing up here, and they say that more accidents happen on the way down than on the way up. And I couldn't get to the top, so I turned around to come back down again. And I stepped on a rock sticking out, which was probably a little bit smaller than this. It was probably about that sort of size there, and it snapped off under my foot, and the rock and I both fell together to the ground. Probably fell, not very far, maybe 10 feet, 12 feet, but the rock fell after me and trapped my leg, and bash onto my leg, and I thought, oh my God, I've broken my thigh. And it occurred to me that none of the monks knew where I was. I was right down this side canyon, middle of nowhere. Would they ever have noticed? They probably wouldn't, because they think, oh, he didn't like it here and he's gone home, because you don't speak to anybody. And so I thought, no, God, now I'm in trouble. How the hell do I get it? But anyway, I thought, oh, perhaps I haven't broken it after all. And I scraped out the sand underneath my leg and made so I got enough room to actually drag my leg out. And so it was bruised, but not broken, thank goodness. And so then I came back and I did this painting. I backed up a little and did this painting. And I thought the rock and the tree really are Christian symbols. The tree, of course, is a symbol of the cross, and the rock is the symbol of the Lord, really. And so I am your rock. And so that's a sort of symbolic painting, and I suppose in thanks for the fact that I didn't actually break my thigh. New Age, I think I only did 2 paintings associated with New Age places. Sedona, and Bell Rock is probably one of the New Age. Actually, there are a couple more, come to think of it. But Bell Rock is probably one of the New Age most important. One of the most important series of ley lines go under Bell Rock, and so there again, the symbols in this case are to do with the New Age. So we've got crystals, we've got heart, we've got a dream catcher, because it seems to be that New Age beliefs are sort of slightly like pick and mix, really. You know, you can have a bit of this and a bit of that, and a bit of Christianity and a bit of Buddhism, and a bit of Native American stuff, and so I sort of put together a collection of. So there's a Buddhist knot. That knot is made by the Buddhists. There's a crystal. There's a little heart, because it's all about peace and love, and then there's a Native American little dream catcher. And the same with this one. This is Cathedral Rock. And the funny thing is, it's a simple enough picture, that, but for some reason, which I still don't know why, I could not get it right. And in fact, I went every morning for 5 days to try and get that exactly right. And on the 5th attempt, I actually got it. But for some reason, I kept getting it wrong. I don't know why. But anyway, finally I made a nice painting out of it, but it was hard won, really. And then Jane Woodward was determined that I should come with her and her pals to raft the San Juan River. And the San Juan is actually very important to the Navajo, who own one side of it, and the Paiutes, who used to own the other, but in fact no longer are around, and also the Mormons. So it's quite important an important river. And so we rafted it, and as is usual with my river journeys, I did a painting every day. In each one, I bought from the Zuni, I bought a fetish to show the things that the animals or birds or whatever that I happened to see while I was doing the painting. And in this case, it's a little squirrel, and so on. It looks like a duck, doesn't it? A bat, and so on. So those are the things I saw. There's a raven. Those are the things I saw when I was doing that painting, and so they're just a little reminder of what I saw at the time. And also, because we found quite a lot of pictographs on the rocks, I thought I would do pictographs for myself to describe the journey. So I did my own diary, really, in pictographs. So all of them have got little symbols on to explain things that happened on our journey. So I was doing kind of present day pictographs. Some people wonder why I insisted on having this cabinet with these objects in it. And I was simply trying to refer directly to the belief systems and faiths that I was dealing with while I was making this series. And so, of course, we've got a Navajo rug. The Navajo are great weavers, as I've said. We've got a Hopi pot by a very fine Hopi potter. We've got a Hopi kachina, and then we've got some Catholic pieces. We've got these lovely crystals for the New Age. The Mormons are very circumspect about having any symbols at all, but of course, if you look at Utah's symbol on their map and on their roads, it's the beehive, the symbol of hard work, and the Mormons are hardworking, and so we got a bee skep. Which looks like a Mormon. And then, of course, we've got all these wonderful fetishes, which are all Zuni. And then these little things here are all little Catholic things. If you've got a broken leg, then you get one of these and you get it blessed and put it up in the church. And so they're simply trying to refer to the fact that this is about people's faith. Now we've got these 4 paintings, which are really a set of 4, because the Navajo have 4 sacred mountains. And they used to delineate their territory. They no longer do because their territory has shrunk. But nonetheless, they still think of them as their sacred mountains, the sacred guardians of their territory. And each of them have a distinct color associated with that mountain. And they also have distinct powers. Each mountain has a distinct power. And so this one is White Mountain, and you can see why it's called White Mountain, because of course although this looks like snow, some of it is snow, but actually a lot of the rock is white too, and that's why it looks white. And it's seen across, in this case, seen across a big salt pond, so that's white as well. And so I filled a glass tube with white salt from this salt pan here, and most of the souvenirs here are white, because I want to accentuate the fact this is all about white. And then even this little fox here, or the little coyote. I spent several days doing this painting, and every day I would walk out to this spot here, and I'd be astonished about how much coyote scat there was everywhere. And yet I never heard a single coyote, and I thought that was very strange. And when I finally finished and packed up my stuff and started to walk out, suddenly there was this enormous chorus of coyotes. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. They're kind of singing me out of the place. And because they'd been completely silent for about 5 days, and then suddenly they all started howling and yowling and yapping at the moment I finally decided I was going to leave, which I thought was marvelous, really. And so there's a white coyote there too. This one is the Blue Mountain, Mount Taylor. This is Mount Taylor here. It erupted and it spewed a lot of black lava all around here, and the lava acted like almost like it sort of lapped up against all this wonderful sandstone. And so you got a wonderful contrast really between the black lava and the sandstone. And it was almost as if you could see the liquid of it coming together. And so to symbolize that particular thing, I crunched up some lava, some black lava here, and this is the sand from the sandstone, because those were the 2 elements of that landscape, I thought. But this is the Blue Mountain. I'm not sure why it's blue, but anyway, all the symbols here, of course, are blue, except all of them have got a gun case with them because of the history really of violence between the Native Americans and the settlers. And so I wanted to point out that everybody had been fighting over these particular lands. And then this is Mount Hesperus, the Black Mountain. There again, it doesn't look particularly black, so I don't know why it's called the Black Mountain, except that I know that it is. And in this case, we've got a little black squirrel, I guess, or a little black fetish of some sort, and all black symbols here. A black feather. This thing here is really interesting. They think it's where lightning has struck a sand dune, and so it's melted the sand into black glass, and so you get like a little pellet of black glass-like stuff made out of melted sand where the lightning has struck it. So I got one of those and put that in too, because I just thought that was such an interesting thing. And the last one, which is up near Flagstaff, Yellow Mountain, Mount Humphreys, and this is Sunset Crater, this thing here, which is actually, Sunset Crater is, I believe, sacred to the Hopi, and Mount Humphreys, which is this one, is sacred to the Navajo. So both communities think of this area as sacred to them. And the color for that is yellow, and so yellow and orange really, and so I've made this this collection here of yellow and orange things. And interesting, when the exhibition was on in Flagstaff, which it went to Flagstaff, to the Museum of Northern Arizona, and I happened to call in, there was a young Navajo student, about 16, 17, I suppose, and she was peering at my notes here and copying them into her notebook. So I said, "What are you up to?" And she said, "Oh, well, we're doing a project for college, and we've been asked to choose works of art that we think are really interesting. So I'm copying down what this chap said." And I said, "Oh, actually, it was, my pictures. Do you want to know anything about them?" So she said, "Oh, well," she liked them and everything. And I said, "Do you understand the symbolism of the way I've tried to depict it?" And she said, "Of course I do." She said, "What, you mean Blue Mountain, Black Mountain?" I said, "Yeah." So she said, "No, of course I do. Yeah, obviously." And so that was marvelous. And so I went off to the bookshop and got her the catalogue and said, "Look, you don't need to copy everything down here. You can have here's the catalogue. Take it away." So I was really pleased that she responded so directly to the work, because that was her culture that I was trying to refer to. Okay, whose is this? Cabezon Peak. I found Cabezon Peak, funnily enough, rather difficult to paint. I did this little painting, which came out pretty quickly and quite nicely. But then when I tried to find somewhere to do a big painting, I found it really hard. And I went round and round Cabezon Peak, and then finally found this spot. And the thing that made it for me was this peculiar arrangement of rocks here. I couldn't work out why these rocks had ended up in that peculiar shape. But anyway, they had, and it seemed natural. They hadn't been piled up by anybody. They just ended up like that. And so I thought that makes a nice foreground. And then your eye kind of tracks around here. But even so, if you can imagine it without the sky, it was a pretty dull picture, really. And so I was struggling with it for a while. And I thought, what I really need is a blooming good sky, an exciting sky, to turn this picture from ordinary to interesting. And just as I was thinking that, I was working on this stuff and thinking about it and wondering how I could make it work. And suddenly this enormous anvil-headed cloud came peering across from the left-hand side, blowing right behind it. And I thought, that's absolutely perfect. Got this wonderful rain coming down and this thing completely strange in the landscape, and yet just exactly what I needed. And sometimes I think there is somebody out there is looking after me, because these things do sometimes happen. If you wait long enough and think hard enough, good things do happen. And funnily enough, just as I was also, I think, fortunate in that while I was sitting here, 3 shots rang out, and someone with a rifle was shooting at me, but they were shooting to miss, I think, because I heard them go fizz, 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 like that past my head. And if I had any hair, it would have parted my hair. But it was very, very close. And I've always wondered what I would do in such a circumstance, and now I know. I thought, well, I reckon that was close enough. He'd been meaning to hit me, he would have. And so therefore he was just trying to give me a scare. And anyway, why would anybody want to kill an artist? The only other person I could think of who would want to kill an artist would be a fellow artist. And so I thought, I don't believe that guy's a fellow artist. I think he's just trying to have some fun. And so I just carried on painting and took no notice, and that was the end of the incident. But I stabbed my pencil through the painting 3 times to kind of remind myself that, so they looked like little bullet holes, to remind myself that had occurred. Yes, Monument Valley. Of course, you have to do Monument Valley. Very, very important to the Navajo, but an enormous tourist trap. So it's a difficult balance to strike, that, because I don't normally work in tourist traps. But I can understand that that's how the Navajo make their money, and it's a popular resort or popular attraction. And of course, there's been endless films have been made in Monument Valley because it is such a startling piece of geology. And so I went and did this painting of the Mittens. I went round the usual track and met a few Navajo and talked to them, and then came back, and I'd seen this before I started almost, but I thought, oh, that would work, but I better go and check on everything else. So I went round to make sure I wasn't just sticking at the first place I came to. And then I sort of walked down into a canyon and sat and did this painting. Anyway, at the end of the day, I thought, the Mittens, that's such a stupid name for such a fantastic piece of geology that I ought to find out what the Navajo name is. And so I went to the office and I said, could you tell me the Navajo name for the mittens? And the girl said, no, I can't. She said, but the chief will be able to. Do you want me to ask him? So I said, oh, okay. So she went and found the chief and said, oh, he'll talk to you if you go through. So I went through and I said, could you tell me what the Navajo name is for the mittens? Because I'm doing a painting of them and you know, it just seems such a silly name for such fantastic things. And he said, well, I do know the name. He said, but that information is worth money. And I said, oh, yeah, okay. And we sort of made a joke of it, but it wasn't really a joke. And the implication was that I was going to sell the painting and make some money, and the Navajo wouldn't make anything out of it, so why should he give me the name? And anyway, eventually he gave me the name, which actually didn't mean much really, because it means the rocks that stick up. But anyway, that was the name. And so I went away, and then I thought, actually, he had a point, really. And so I went back and saw him again. I said, listen, I've been thinking about this. I think you've got a point. You're right. If I sell this painting, I shall make some money. My dealer will make some money, and you won't make anything out of it, and it's your land. So how about if I sell it, if I give 10% to the Navajo? So he said, oh, okay, that's fair. So I said, but I don't want it to just go into general taxation or general funds. I said, could we do something like, I said, it'll be quite expensive, so there'll be a decent chunk of money. How about if we were to have a little scholarship for one of the children or something? So he said, oh, that's a good idea. Okay, we'll do that. So he gave me his name, and sure enough, when it was sold, I sent my 10% to him, and it was set up as a little scholarship for children, or for one of the children. And so I sort of carried that on with a few other things too, because it seemed to me that actually the people who made most money out of Monument Valley were the people who owned the hotel just right on the border of it, who were taking a lot of their water, and the rooms were something like $250 a night, and a lot of tourists were paying that, going in, whizzing around Monument Valley, whizzing back out again, and hardly spending a penny in there really. So it seemed to me that I could see why they were a bit disgruntled. And this too is Monument Valley, but seen from a higher elevation, and in fact seen from more or less from that big painting over there. We'll talk about that one now, I think. After I'd been on the San Juan River, the San Juan River goes round here. This was part of our river journey, around this thing called the goosenecks, and you can see it sort of goes round and round and round and round like that. Most complicated piece of geology, really, but very interesting. And there's a place called Muley Point, which is way up above all of that, which looks down on it and looks out to Monument Valley here. I wandered up and down the rim of Muley Point to find something that worked visually, and finally came across this marvelous spot here with this wonderful rock stack in the middle. So that gives you a kind of perspective, really, to be able to look over the edge and see, you know, the river disappearing miles below you into this extraordinary canyon system. And so I spent quite a long time up there, 12 days doing this painting, and it was pretty difficult because we had a tremendous sandstorm one night, or one day, 24 hours really, when I had to do nothing but lie in my tent to hold it down and get covered in sand. And I was pretty fed up really. And then when I got out, when the things finally subsided, I found that my drawing board, which is made out of marine ply, had been torn apart as if it was cardboard. I mean, it had just shredded and thrown all over the landscape. But as luck would have it, I happened to have an old drawing board with me, so I managed to reassemble some bits with the new bits with old bits and make another drawing board and finish the painting off. But I was a bit fed up at the time, I must admit. And these little studies of stones here, they're all napped stones where the Native Americans have made arrowheads and axes and so on. There were just piles of them everywhere, piles of napped stones. So it was obviously a very popular spot as far as the Native Americans were concerned. And that was interesting. So I did all these little studies of napped stones that I found and left them where they were. And there's an arrowhead made by a Navajo called Homer Etherton, who was 86 years old and made me some beautiful arrowheads. And this here, one day some friends arrived from Sedona with a picnic and to cheer me up, and they said we're going to go and look for duck-headed men down below here, exactly below here somewhere. There are these duck-headed men inscribed on the rocks. Okay, and so off we went, and we were looking hard and couldn't find anything, and then suddenly Pam said, "There's one," and sure enough, there on this rock was this strange thing here. It's undoubtedly a man's body and a duck's head, and nobody knows why. There's nobody has the faintest idea why that should be, but it's very distinctly obvious that's what it is. And so we were very pleased that we'd found it, and I did a little duck-headed man there. And while we're at it on the San Juan River, this was part of the San Juan journey that we did in our rafts. And at one point we scrambled up to this point here, and I looked out and I said, now that would make a big painting. And so I've got to come back here. And so, I don't know, a few weeks actually after I'd done that painting, I then came down and did this painting and lived underneath a cottonwood tree by the river here, I think for about 12 days on my own, and didn't see anybody really that entire time. But this is very important to the Mormons because it's something to do, I never quite figured out what, but it's something to do with a Mormon trail that went along the ridge of this rock here. And it went for miles. There's a rocky ridge which they followed for miles into the desert, and it was part of the Mormon trail. And they really revered that particular spot. So it's something to do with the Mormons, but also in here, it was also to do with the Paiutes. This side of the river was Paiute. And so I thought the Paiutes really left very little trace. They just used to live in little wickiups made out of sticks. And the only thing they were known for really were their baskets. They could apparently make baskets that were so brilliant that they would hold water. And also their beadwork. And so I thought, if you were an archaeologist and you were looking for evidence of the Paiutes, what on earth would you find? And so I sort of put in some sand, and I put some beads, because you'd find some beads, glass beads, and you'd also, tucked in there somewhere, but you can hardly see it, are little bits of basket, little bits of reeds where you could imagine them making baskets and just little bits being left over. So that's all you'd find if you were an archaeologist looking for evidence of the Paiutes. And here is a Mormon symbol scratched into the rock, and a little pictograph, and of course another Navajo arrowhead to refer to the Navajos who own that side of the river. It's just, if you're doing something quick like I was here, I was just trying to catch this rainstorm coming in before it hit me, and the quickest, if you're testing your colours, the quickest way to do it is just to test it on the corner of the picture. Normally speaking, I would cut that off, but I just thought this whole thing was just such an immediate little sketch, really, that it was silly to pretend it was a major work of art. So I simply left the whole thing as it was and just and framed it as it was, because it's just like, it's trying to explain, this was quick, and and this thing was about to hit me, so I'm going to get it done quickly. And what I loved about that was the sun was striking this just as the clouds were gathering and kind of come over it and obliterate it. So I was just trying to catch that, and I often do that test the colour on the side of the paper before I actually use it, because watercolour is a very unforgiving medium, and if you make a mistake, you're done for, really. And so I always try and make sure that before I apply colour, that it is the right colour I'm putting on. So that's what that's about, really. It's just a sort of a quick, just trying to save time. Zion National Park. There again, that's Paiute, really. There again, we've got these little shreds of reeds and basket-making equipment and beads, because that's what I thought you would find, and a little dream catcher. And there again, Mormon. Of course, it's Zion, where that's to do with Mormons. And so we've got the Mormon symbols here, the bee skip, and some Mormon things. And then we've got the National Park Artist in Residence certificate, because I arrived there and discovered that the director there was a great fan of mine, a fellow called Lyman Hafen, I think his name, something like that. He said, "Oh, Tony, oh, are you going to come and paint?" And I said, "Yeah, that's the idea." He said, "Well," he said, "where are you going to stay?" So I said, "Well, I guess I'll have to camp." And he said, "Well, we've got this little cottage. I don't know if you'd be interested." So I said, "Yeah, are you kidding? Of course I would." And so he lent me this little cottage tucked away under the cliff, and it was just delightful. And I was very happy there. And so I hiked all around a big area of Zion for quite a long time, a couple of days, and blow me, thank goodness in a way, the best place I found to paint was exactly outside my front door of my cottage. So it was the most convenient campsite you could ever have. And the only thing I had to do was give a lecture to pay, to sing for my supper sort of thing. And also I discovered that the person in charge of the education there was a ranger who she had been a great help to me in Hawaii when I'd been working in Hawaii. And then she came to Zion, and so she said, "Tony, what are you doing here?" I said, "I've come to do this." And she said, "Oh, how fantastic!" And so she helped me set up my lecture and came. I had supper with her. She had supper with me, and then blow me. Last time I went to the Grand Canyon, there she was again. She's now head of education in the Grand Canyon. So all the, things go in circles. But anyway, that was a very happy period. Quite hard to paint, actually, I found, but nonetheless a delightful time to spend there. And then the last one I did on the entire series, I couldn't really not do something about the Havasupai, which is the tribe that lived down halfway down the Grand Canyon in the most idyllic spot you could possibly imagine. And they do have a rule, the Havasupai, that they don't allow professional painters, or any painters really, don't allow professional painters to make paintings, and they don't allow professional photographers to take photographs. And so I arrived you arrive at the top of the canyon, of course, at the rim of the Grand Canyon. There are some very substantial Havasupai women who control everything. And they looked at me and they saw my drawing board and my aluminium tube and all my stuff. And they said, "What are you up to?" And I said, "Well, I'm hoping to come down and do a painting down there, down in one of the waterfalls." And they said, "We don't allow paintings." So I said, "No, I understand that, but I said I want to talk to the tribal chief and see if he'll allow it, and I want to discuss it with him." I said, "I've hired a horse packer to come up from the village to pick my stuff up and take it down. So, and if the tribal chief says I can't, then that's fine. I won't do it. But I would like to talk to him first." So they said, "Oh, okay, well, you won't be allowed to." So I said, "No, but I don't want to leave my stuff up here anyway, and I want to go down and camp down there. So you're allowed to camp down there." And so they're, "Okay, up to you." So anyway, so the horse packer came up and we loaded the stuff on the horse, and then he took it down, and I hiked down a couple of thousand feet, or 2,500 feet, I think, down to where there's this delightful little village down there. No cell phone service, I don't think, maybe now, but there wasn't then. Little tiny fields, people growing corn and beans and maize and doing it was almost like a medieval village, really, and everything on horseback, no vehicles. Everything was done on horseback. It's the only place in the country where the mail is still brought down by Pony Express. Yeah, extraordinary and wonderful, lovely feeling, very quiet, very, very nice. Everybody just getting on with their business. Anyway, I went to see the tribal chief. As luck would have it, he was an artist himself. And he'd done some prints, and so we talked about those. And so he said, "So what do you want?" And I said, "Well, I'd love to do a painting. I'm doing a series of paintings about sacred places, and I know this is sacred to you. And I wondered whether I could do a painting of one of the waterfalls." And he said, "Well, we don't really allow it." So I said, "No, I understand that, but I wondered if you'd be interested in the same deal that I did with the Navajo, that I'll give 10% of the sale price for a scholarship for one of the children." So he said, "Well, I'll think about it." But he said, "I'll allow you to start, but at the end, you have to come and show me how long are you going to be? So I said, about 10 days. And he said, okay, well, at the end of 10 days, you have to bring what you've done so far, and the tribal council will look at it, and if we decide that we don't like it, you will have to tear it up. And I said, okay, well, I'll accept that. So I went and pitched my tent in the campsite, which is about 2 miles past the village. And I mean, when you come round the corner after all that hot walking down the canyons and so on, it's very, very hot. You come around the corner and you see this extraordinary waterfall which comes out of here, look. It's plunging out, huge waterfall, and then it comes down and it forms another big waterfall here, and then this fantastic turquoise water. It is just breathtaking. And so I set up my drawing board and started work, and at first they'd come up behind me on their horses, and they'd look. And of course, I was only doing the drawing. There wasn't much to look at. And then they would just go off without saying a word. Nothing. After a couple of days, they'd actually get off their horse and sit behind me and still say nothing. And sit behind me sometimes for an hour or more and still not say a word. And then get back on their horse and go away again. After about 4 or 5 days, they'd sit behind me for a while, and then they go, and then nothing. And then 6 or 7 days, and they were, it's coming on, and anyway, so they started to chat, and in the end they were quite, I wouldn't say they were gushing, but they were friendly, and so I think 7 days later, I took my picture to the tribal council, and I spread it out on the floor. And I said, that's as far as I've got. I have to finish it in my studio, so there's a lot of work to do, but that's as far as I've got. And they conferred together, and they said, could we have a copy of it? And I said, well, I don't do copies of my paintings really, but I would have a copy made for you, but it's a very expensive thing to do, just have one copy, a perfect copy. I said, no, we're not going to do a limited edition or anything like that. So that would be a very expensive thing to do. So I can't do 10% and the copy. Either one, I don't mind which, but I can't do both. And they said, and they conferred for a bit, they said, we'd rather have the copy, because then we can hang it in our tribal council room, and we'd like that. And why have you only done one waterfall? And I said, well, that's all I had the time for. And they said, well, we've got 7 down here, why don't you come and do the rest? And so I never did go back to do the rest, but I was very flattered that they would ask. And so, of course, I had the copy made and sent it to them, and that's the end of that story, really. But, so that was the last painting of the series. Now, any questions?
I was told you originally start with the sky first, and you work your way forward.
Right.
Is that the only exception for that one?
Well, it's a thing I hate to do, because what happens is if you start painting the landscape before you've got the sky, everything in the landscape depends on the sky. The color, the shadows, everything depends on what's happening in the sky. And what happens is if you leave the sky till last, you then find that all the tones in the painting are probably wrong, and you have to readjust them all to get it right. And so I hate to do that, and so if I can, I'll paint the sky. But if you haven't got a sky, I mean, in deserts very often it's just a blank blue, and you can't even do a big blank blue sky in the field, because there's a certain technique for doing that, and you can't do it in the middle of nowhere. You have to have absolutely scrupulous kind of conditions to do it. And so I always need clouds and things happening in the sky. And anyway, it's just much more exciting to have a decent sky with, something happening. And so I always just wait until I get one. And if I have to wait a darn long time, that's very frustrating. And so usually, I try and start with the sky if I've got one. And even if I've just drawn the horizon line quickly and then do the sky, and I can worry about the rest after that. But so long as there's something going on. But if there's nothing, just blank blue, you just have to wait until you see something. Because these are about the actual time I was there. So I don't invent a sky. I wait until I see one. Just like with that painting there, with Cabezon Peak. I knew what I wanted, but there didn't seem any chance I'd get it, and then suddenly I did get it. And so it came up and I painted it. But it's always best to start with the sky if you can.
The four sacred mountains, which was your favorite one to go paint or go to hike?
Oh, the favourite one to paint. I guess the one I'm fondest of in a way is Mount Hesperus, only because really my very great friend Bill Brace, who was director of the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at MIT, and I'd travelled with many times for years with Bill. We'd been on great long journeys together. He's a great geologist. He used to explain the landscape to me in the most wonderful way, and that was the last painting I ever worked on with him. He died about 8-10 years ago, I suppose, and that was the last one I ever did in his company. And so I'm very fond of that painting because it reminds me of Bill. But I guess in terms of which was nicest to do, it's probably this one, I think. Although it was very cold, I was camping in the backcountry on my own, and it was very cold, but nonetheless, there was something about the contrast between the sand and the lava and the mountain and that fabulous sky. We're talking about skies. I mean, that's a fabulous one. It was the end of the day, I remember, and I painted quite a bit of this stuff, and I looked up and I saw this sky forming, and I just thought, oh wow, I've got to get that. And so I laid the thing down and sat and painted it almost until it got dark, because it was just such a fantastic storm coming up. And then I suddenly thought, wait a minute, storm coming up. I better get my tent erected. Anyway, so I rushed back, put my tent up and crawled into it just as the thing hit. But it was just, in terms of the place I was sitting and the view and the just the general appearance of the place, that was the one I guess was the nicest to do. But this one has got I have a great feeling for my dear friend Bill because of that one.
For most of this journey here, did you need to get permission to enter these particular locations?
The only place really you needed permission was Canyon de Chelly. As for the rest, I just used to go, and generally, I mean, the native people generally I found are not immediately friendly. They tend to, I mean, I would give them rides in my car, or I would try and be friendly, but generally they weren't that friendly really. But then when they saw what I was doing, they'd get interested and they'd become much more friendly. I don't see, they're very suspicious of Europeans, and who can be surprised at that? And so I tried not to intrude, and I tried just to be quiet and respectful. And in fact, when the exhibition was held and opened, I invited all the Native Americans I'd met. I invited them, and my art dealer said, "Well, you realise, Tony, that if they don't like your exhibition, they could easily close the place down. They could easily just barricade the door and not let anybody in if they don't like it." So I hadn't realised quite what a risk I was taking. But anyway, so the exhibition opened, and we had the opening party, and lots of Native Americans came. And this Navajo lady came and threw her arms around me, and she said, "You treated us with great respect." And so I thought, oh, I guess I've got it right. But it was a nerve-wracking time, because I hadn't realised that would be the case. And I can't say I blame them. I think they've got a lot to. I understand why they would feel resentful at somebody trampling around in their sacred places and trying to help make an exhibition out of it. I mean, you are treading a very sensitive line, really. And so I suppose I was kind of ignorant of the situation in a way. I was aware of it, I suppose, a bit, but I was just pleased that they felt that I had actually been respectful, because that was certainly my intention. Actually, yes, what came from it was because Jane came or organized actually the journey on the San Juan River. I was sitting on a rock one day painting, and she was sitting nearby reading a book, I think. And then she said, "The trouble with your exhibitions, Tony, I've been thinking about this, the trouble with your exhibitions is they're all on a particular theme. You work on 2 or 3 years on a theme, And all the paintings are associated with that. They're very closely organized so that when you have the exhibition, you know, it all makes a kind of coherent sense. And she said it's a bit like if you were a novelist, you know, writing a novel, and then in order to make a living, you sold it off chapter by chapter. She said it would be far better, wouldn't it, if we kept the whole, you know, if the whole thing was kept together. And I said, oh yeah, right, what a good idea. How's that ever going to work? And she said, well, how would it be if I bought the entire exhibition? And I said, what on earth would you do with it? I said, you haven't got enough room for it, Jane. And she said, no, not for me. She said, but I would want to buy it for the public benefit. I would either give it to a museum, or if that didn't work, you know, I'd find some way of doing it for the public benefit. And I said, well, I think that's something we could talk about. So we discussed it, and finally, Jane decided that this was the best way to bring it to the public in this magnificent way that she's got it organized and converted this building into the most exquisite space. And I mean, no living artist could ever dream of such a thing happening. Certainly I never dreamt of it. And I'm humbled by just the extraordinary nature of this place. And every time I come, I sort of gasp with amazement that such a thing exists. So yeah, and that was all because Jane was on that particular river journey and had that brainwave, or I don't know if it's a brainwave or a rush of lunacy to the head, but either way, whatever it was, it's resulted in this wonderful, wonderful place. So yes, all credit to Jane for that lightning inspiration. It's certainly made a difference to my life, and I guess made a difference to other people's too, which is great.
Thank you very much.